We were 7 in total, all friends since high school, and we thought we knew each other like the backs of our hands. Every year, we had this tradition, a weekend camping trip to celebrate our friendship. This year, we chose a remote location deep within the Pine Barrens, a place known more for its eerie legends than its beauty. Maybe it was arrogance, or maybe we just didn't believe in the old stories, but none of us hesitated when we planned the trip. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. As we set up our tents, there was an odd stillness in the air, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I chalked it up to my nerves. City life had made me unaccustomed to the silence of the woods. Once everything was in place, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. The mood was light, and soon enough, the nervous energy I'd felt earlier began to fade. But then, the conversation turned to the legends of the Pine Barrens. "Has anyone heard about the Jersey Devil?" Mark asked, his voice low and serious. "Yeah, my grandma used to tell me about it when I was a kid," Sarah replied. "She said it's this creature with the head of a goat, bat wings, and cloven hooves. Supposedly, it roams these woods, screaming into the night." "Come on, that's just a silly story," Kevin scoffed, but his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "We're more likely to run into a bear than some mythical beast." "There's more than just the Jersey Devil out here," Emily added, her voice almost a whisper. "I read about these woods before we came. People have gone missing in here, hikers, campers, even entire search parties. They say the forest can swallow you whole." "Swallow you whole?" I echoed, trying to keep my tone light, but a shiver ran down my spine. "Yeah, like you'll be walking, and suddenly you're lost. The path disappears, and the trees start to close in on you. People vanish without a trace. And sometimes, they say you can hear their voices, calling for help." Silence fell over the group. The fire crackled, but it seemed less warm now, more sinister. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the growing tension. "Well, as long as we stick together, we'll be fine. Right?" No one answered. As the night wore on, we started to relax again. Kevin and Mark joked about setting up a prank to scare the others, while Sarah and Emily shared spooky stories they'd heard as kids. The fire burned low, and the woods around us grew darker, more oppressive. It was around midnight when things started to get strange. It began with a sound, faint at first, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. We all heard it, but none of us could make out the words. It was like someone was talking just out of earshot, their voice low and urgent. "What the hell is that?" Jason asked, standing up and peering into the darkness. "Probably just the wind," Kevin said, though his voice lacked conviction. The whispering continued, growing louder, closer. It seemed to circle the campsite, moving through the trees. My heart began to race, and I could tell by the wide-eyed looks on everyone's faces that they were just as scared as I was. "Maybe we should check it out," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound thrilled by the idea. "Are you crazy?" Sarah snapped. "We're not splitting up." The whispering stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. We all froze, straining to hear anything, footsteps, rustling leaves, anything that could explain the sound. But there was nothing. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a scream. It was high-pitched, filled with terror, and it sent a jolt of fear through all of us. It was the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold, the kind that tells you something is horribly, terribly wrong. "Did you guys hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Hear it?" "It was impossible to miss," Jason said, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. "Now." "But where would we go?" The cars were a good 2 miles back, and the path was narrow and winding. In the pitch dark, it would be easy to get lost. But staying here didn't feel any safer. "Let's just stay together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If we leave the fire, we're going to get lost. We just need to wait it out until morning." No one argued. We all huddled closer to the fire, our eyes darting around the darkened woods. The once comforting crackle of the flames now seemed like a beacon, drawing in whatever might be lurking out there. The scream echoed through the woods again, closer this time. It was followed by a rustling in the trees, like something was moving swiftly through the underbrush. "Did you see that?" Mark whispered, pointing toward the darkness. "What?" Kevin asked, his voice tight. "There, by that tree." Something moved. I squinted into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. But then I saw it, a shape, dark and indistinct, slipping between the trees. "There's someone out there," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to get out of here," Sarah repeated, her voice almost a whimper now. Before we could make a decision, the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, clearer. The voices were speaking in unison, their tone harsh and urgent, but the words were still unintelligible. It was like they were speaking in a language none of us understood. The rustling grew louder, closer. We could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot, as if something, or someone, was moving through the woods toward us. "I'm not staying here," Kevin said suddenly, standing up. "I'm not waiting to find out what that is." "Kevin, wait!" I shouted, but he was already moving, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he headed down the path we'd come from. "Damn it," Mark muttered, grabbing his own flashlight. "We can't let him go alone." One by one, we all stood up, following Kevin. The forest closed in around us as we left the clearing, the trees pressing in on either side of the narrow path. The whispering voices seemed to follow us, growing louder, more insistent. "Do you think it's people?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "Maybe someone's playing a prank on us." "I don't know," I said, not believing it for a second. "But we need to keep moving." The path twisted and turned, the darkness swallowing our flashlight beams. The forest was unnaturally quiet now, except for the whispers that seemed to echo in our heads. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump, our nerves frayed and on edge. Then, out of nowhere, Kevin screamed. We ran toward the sound, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted down the path. When we reached him, he was standing in the middle of the trail, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I asked, grabbing his shoulder. There was something," he stammered, pointing into the woods. "Something watching me. I saw its eyes." "Where?" Jason asked, shining his flashlight in the direction Kevin was pointing. "I don't know," Kevin said, his voice trembling. "It was there 1 second, and then it was gone." "We need to keep moving," Sarah urged. "The cars aren't far. We can make it." But as we continued down the path, the whispering grew louder, closer, until it was as if the voices were right beside us. They were speaking so fast, so urgently, that it felt like they were trying to warn us or curse us. We stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights barely penetrating the thick blackness. The path seemed to twist and turn in ways it hadn't before, and I began to feel disoriented, like we were walking in circles. "Are we lost?" Emily asked, her voice small and frightened. "No," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We just need to keep going." But the path was different now, narrower, more overgrown. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches clawing at our clothes as we passed. The whispering was deafening, a cacophony of voices that made it hard to think. And then, we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among the trees, a dark shape that seemed to shift and move in the darkness. But as we got closer, it became more defined, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing just off the path. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice shaky. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, watching us with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "Let's go," I whispered, pulling on Mark's arm. "Now." We turned and ran, the path blurring beneath our feet as we sprinted through the forest. The whispering followed us, louder and more frantic, as if the voices were chasing us. The figure was gone, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. We didn't stop until we burst out of the trees and into the clearing where our cars were parked. We piled into the vehicles, our hands shaking as we fumbled with the keys. As the engines roared to life, I glanced back at the edge of the woods. The figure was there, standing at the tree line, watching us with those glowing eyes. We sped away, leaving the forest behind, but the sense of unease didn't fade. The whispering voices, the figure in the trees, they haunted me, echoing in my mind long after we were miles away. No one spoke during the drive home, the silence heavy with what we'd experienced. But I knew we were all thinking the same thing: whatever had followed us in those woods wasn't done with us yet. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought something back with us, something dark, something malevolent, something that wouldn't let us go so easily. But that's a story for another night. The days that followed were a blur. We didn't talk much about what happened in the Pine Barrens, but the memory of that night clung to us like a shadow we couldn't shake. I returned to my apartment, hoping that the familiar surroundings would help me forget, but it didn't take long for the strangeness to begin. It started small, things out of place, strange noises in the middle of the night. I'd wake up to the sound of whispering, the same indecipherable murmur that had followed us through the woods. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was still shaken up from the trip. But the incidents became more frequent, more tangible, until I couldn't ignore them any longer. One night, about a week after we'd returned, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart pounded as I grabbed a baseball bat from under my bed and crept into the living room. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse in my throat as I reached the doorway. My living room was a mess. Books were scattered across the floor, pictures had fallen from the walls, and the coffee table was overturned. But what caught my attention was the mirror. It hung above the fireplace, and in its reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure stood behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My hands shook as I turned back to the mirror, only to find the figure gone. The whispering started again, louder this time, filling my head with its frantic, disjointed words. I dropped the bat and clamped my hands over my ears, trying to drown out the noise, but it only grew more intense. In the reflection, the room behind me began to distort. The shadows lengthened, and the walls seemed to close in, darkening until the room looked just like the forest where we'd seen that figure, where the whispering had first begun. And then, for a split second, I saw them again, those glowing eyes, watching me from the darkness. I screamed and threw the bat at the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. My heart raced, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I stared at the broken shards on the floor. Each piece reflected a different part of the room, but in all of them, I saw the same thing, those eyes, glaring back at me. The next day, I called the others. I needed to know if they were experiencing the same things, or if I was losing my mind. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the only place that felt neutral enough, far enough away from our homes and the memories of that night. As soon as I saw their faces, I knew I wasn't alone. They all looked haunted, their eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, their expressions tight with fear. We sat in a corner booth, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid the whispers would follow us even here. "It's been happening to you too, hasn't it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. "Every night. The whispers, the shadows. I feel like I'm being watched all the time." "Same here," Mark added, his voice strained. "I see things in mirrors, in windows, like something's following me, waiting." I tried telling myself it was just in my head, Emily said, her voice cracking. "But it's real, isn't it? Whatever it was out there, it's here now." "We should have never gone to those woods," Jason muttered, his eyes darting around the diner. "We brought something back with us, something evil." Kevin, who had been quiet until now, suddenly looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "I saw it last night," he said, his voice trembling. "I woke up, and it was standing at the foot of my bed, just watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, it felt like it was draining the life out of me." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had felt the same paralysis, the same terror, but hearing it from Kevin made it all the more real. We were all experiencing the same thing, whatever had attached itself to us, it was growing stronger, more aggressive. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with desperation. "We can't keep living like this. It's going to kill us. There has to be a way to get rid of it," I said, though I didn't know if I believed it. Maybe we need to go back to the forest. Maybe that's where it wants us." "Are you crazy?" Jason snapped. "Going back there is what got us into this mess. We need to stay as far away from that place as possible." "But what if it's the only way to stop this?" I argued. "We can't just wait for it to come for us. We need to face it." The table fell silent as we all considered the possibility. The thought of returning to those woods filled me with dread, but I couldn't deny the pull, the sense that we had unfinished business there. Finally, Mark spoke up. "If we do this, we need to do it together. Whatever happens, we can't let it divide us. We have to be stronger than it." Reluctantly, the others agreed. We made plans to meet at the edge of the Pine Barrens the next evening, just before sunset. None of us wanted to go back, but it was clear that we had no choice. The terror that had followed us home wouldn't rest until it had us all. The drive back to the Pine Barrens was filled with a suffocating silence. Each of us was lost in our thoughts, the weight of what we were about to face pressing down on us. When we finally arrived, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. We parked our cars and gathered our flashlights, the tension between us almost unbearable. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but eventually, I took a deep breath and broke the silence. "Whatever happens, we stick together," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We face this thing head on, and we end it, once and for all." The others nodded, their faces grim. We started down the path that had led us to our original campsite, the trees closing in around us like they had that night. The further we went, the darker it became, until the last light of day had completely faded, leaving us alone in the pitch-black forest. The whispering began again almost immediately, faint at first, but growing louder with each step we took. The trees seemed to move with us, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that made it hard to tell what was real and what was not. "This is where it started," Mark said, stopping abruptly. "This is where we saw it." We had reached the clearing where we'd camped before, though it looked different now, darker, more sinister. The fire pit was still there, but it was cold and dead, surrounded by the remnants of our last visit. The whispering was louder here, almost deafening, and I could feel the presence of something watching us, waiting. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible over the whispers. "We call it out," I said, though my heart was racing with fear. "We confront it, and we make it leave us alone." "Confront it?" Kevin repeated, his voice shaking. "How do we do that?" Before I could answer, the whispering stopped, plunging the forest into an unnatural silence. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the light from our flashlights. And then, from the darkness, the figure emerged. It was just as we remembered, tall, gaunt, with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. But now, it was clearer, more defined. It stepped into the clearing, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the fear radiating from us. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice trembling but firm. "What do you want from us?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It simply stared at us, those eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Answer me," I shouted, taking a step forward despite the terror that gripped me. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed directly at me. The air around us grew colder still, and I felt an invisible force pressing down on me, suffocating me. "You took something," a voice echoed in my mind, not spoken aloud but felt, a cold, hollow whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Something that does not belong to you." I glanced at the others, seeing the same realization dawn on their faces. In our rush to leave that night, in our terror, we had taken something that was never meant to leave this place. A keepsake, a rock, a branch, something insignificant, but it was enough to anger whatever spirit haunted these woods. "What did we take?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Tell us, and we'll return it. We'll make it right." The figure didn't respond, but the pressure lifted slightly, as if it was giving us a chance. We all frantically searched our memories, trying to recall what we might have taken. And then, Mark's eyes widened with realization. "The stone," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, smooth rock, one that he had picked up by the campfire on the first night. I thought it was cool, so I kept it. I didn't think it meant anything. The figure's gaze locked onto the stone, and the air around us shifted, the oppressive feeling growing stronger. Mark, his hands trembling, stepped forward and placed the stone on the ground in front of the figure. "I'm sorry," he whispered, backing away slowly. "I didn't mean to take it." For a moment, nothing happened. The figure remained still, its eyes glowing in the darkness. But then, the whispering began again, this time softer, more distant, as if it was receding into the forest. The figure slowly lowered its hand, and the pressure around us eased. The figure began to fade, its form becoming less solid, more like a shadow dissolving into the night. The glow of its eyes dimmed, and soon, it was gone, leaving us alone in the clearing once more. We stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. But the forest was silent, the oppressive presence lifted. Whatever it was that had haunted us, it seemed to be satisfied. We had returned what we had taken, and now, it was letting us go. "We need to leave," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "Now, before it changes its mind." No one argued. We turned and hurried back down the path, not daring to look back. The forest seemed less menacing now, the trees no longer pressing in on us, the shadows less sinister. But we didn't relax until we were back at our cars, the engines running, and the Pine Barrens disappearing in our rearview mirrors. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. We didn't speak about what had happened, and we didn't need to. We all understood that we had come too close to something beyond our understanding, something that we were lucky to escape. That night, I slept without nightmares, without whispers haunting my dreams. The presence that had followed us was gone, and for the first time in days, I felt at peace. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of what was out there. The Pine Barrens held secrets, dark, ancient secrets that were better left undisturbed. And I knew, deep down, that we had been given a warning. We had survived, but only just. There were things in this world that were beyond our comprehension, forces that could not be reasoned with or escaped. We had been spared, but the memories would never leave us, a constant reminder of the night we ventured into the heart of darkness and came face to face with the unknown. And though we had escaped, I couldn't help but feel that somewhere, deep in those woods, something was still watching, still waiting. For the next group of campers, for the next careless soul who didn't heed the warnings. The Pine Barrens were alive, and they were hungry. Point 2.